So I have another soul winning tip video for you guys, and it's a very simple tip. The tip is that you should ask questions throughout your gospel presentation to basically keep the person engaged that you're speaking to. Okay. Now, in theory, you could treat your gospel presentation like a lecture, where you're basically just kind of showing them the verses, saying it to them, and go to the next verse and explain that to them, and just kind of, go through these verses and just kind of basically you do 100% of the talking, and all they're doing is just like listening, right? However, the thing is, though, is that that's not really a very effective way to preach the gospel to someone, because of the fact that oftentimes, especially if you're talking to someone that's a younger generation, if they're just listening but they're not like verbally engaging with what you're talking about, they're much more. It's a lot easier for them to kind of forget what you were just talking about. They might have a harder time remembering these things, and also if they're not verbally saying or agreeing with the points that you're making throughout the presentation, then also it's going to be harder for them to internalize that belief for themselves because you're just telling them that, but they're not saying it themselves, right? And so oftentimes it's a good idea to teach people by asking questions so that they can understand things and kind of internalize it for themselves. So that way, when you do get to the recap, they're going to be more likely to kind of agree with everything you mentioned, right? So oftentimes, in order to keep the person engaged, just so that they're not bored and they're just kind of just listening like it's a lecture, it's a good idea to ask questions throughout the presentation, questions that are very easy to understand, questions that are not like complicated, no trick questions or anything like that, just to keep them engaged so that they're not bored and so that they can kind of more internalize those beliefs, right? So for example, another thing too as well, and something I don't want to forget about, is that when you ask questions to the unsaved person, what you're doing is that you're figuring out what they themselves personally believe, right? And then addressing those things right away. And so, for example, like one big thing that I like to do is that when I'm discussing the concept of hell, like when I talk about Romans 6:23, it says that the wages of sin is death, and I explain that's a spiritual death that the Bible refers to as hell. You go to Revelation 20 to prove that, and then you can just ask them like, do you believe that hell exists, right? Because it would be kind of weird if like you're going through the whole presentation with someone and then you recap and ask those questions to them to make sure they understand it, and now you have to like cover all this material in the recap, and it kind of makes things a bit longer, whereas you can preemptively deal with those things during the presentation itself by just simply asking them, hey, do you believe that hell exists, right? And if they say no, right, maybe because they just don't know, they're not aware about what the Bible says about it, then you can kind of address that point right there and explain more about hell, because they specifically said they don't believe in hell or they don't know about hell, or what have you, and explain it to them and address it right then and there. But obviously, you would only be able to do that if you specifically ask them the question about hell and perhaps about other things as well, asking them about the Trinity, asking them about whether Jesus was a sinner or do you think he was 100% perfect and things like that. So you can preemptively deal with those things right then and there without having to necessarily address all these things in the recap. Because relatively speaking, the recap should be long enough so that you're thorough in addressing things, especially salvation, but you don't want it to be like super long or what have you. And that's why I like to ask some of those questions in the presentation itself, so that by the time I get to the recap, mainly the recap is mainly emphasizing the questions about salvation, eternal security, and things of that sort. Kind of like the main point of your gospel presentation, which is salvation, and that's typically what I would emphasize there. So that being said, just make sure that when you keep the person engaged, you do that by asking questions throughout the presentation, right? Obviously, don't go to the other extreme where you're just berating them with a bunch of questions and it's like it's just them doing a lot of talking. Obviously, you still want to guide the conversation, you still want to lead the conversation, and you're the one asking the questions and you're the one explaining to them what the correct belief is. And if they say something wrong, you correct it using the Bible. Like I get that, but obviously, don't just berate them. Don't make it feel like an interrogation, right? Make sure that the questions that you're asking is helping to gauge, to make sure that they understand it, to make sure that they're kind of relatively engaged in the conversation so that they're not bored, so that it doesn't feel like a lecture. So asking questions about the presentation is a good idea, and that's what I always do for my gospel presentation.